Okay. For POIs, just say it through voice and just say it once. As the partner of the leading expert of being in a non-romantic household, she told me to say that, by the way, we would like a world that is non-stable, not that is stable for the parents and the kids and the families involved. I think romantic relationships are just far too volatile for the constant need and support that the kid needs to have a stable household, to be mentally prepared, and to be developed properly. What does the world look like? So our world on our side, where co-parenting is primarily non-romantic, it can come in the form of groups, it can come in the form of pairs of people consenting to have a kid. This can maybe run into an IVF or the traditional ways of conceiving, but the point is there's still people that actively make the decision to want to have a kid, but not as a natural progression of romance. Furthermore, we're going to argue why this is something of a conducive environment and is actually the best environment to raise kids in relative to what we have in the status quo. So this debate is just a simple comparison of which in which. The second thing I want to preempt is I don't think any opposition team should be able to argue about the world not working with maybe shortages, for example, in labor and the like, because in order to debate this world, we have to assume that worlds will will and can exist. The main thing that this debate affects is the relationships, dynamics, and the kids involved in this. Sure, PY. Um,
So,
oh,
sorry, so could you just detail a bit more? How do people choose to be in these non-romantic relationships? How do governments approach it? What are the differences in terms of the government structure and social structure for it?
that's a lot. Well, I'm just gonna say if there's a person and there's another person, I'm gonna say let's have a kid. They consent. Then there's probably contracts and the like. There's agreements of how they're gonna raise their kids. It's that simple. It just does not have to be romantic. Next, sure, CEO clarification.
So just to be clear, if co-parents cannot or should not have sexual relationships, then how do co-parents get children? So is it like romantic relationships automatically
Um,
put your child up for adoption?
So literally, we just told you you can have IVF, you can literally just have a surrogate, for example. It does not matter what the means is, do you have to assume that it does exist. So then, why exactly is it that kids are just far better in a raised environment on our side? What's wrong with status quo? There's four main things that is wrong with the status quo environment where romantic relationships happen in their parents. More often than not, kids are neglected or not developed properly. There's four main reasons why. The first thing is because in the status quo, the decision to have a kid is just a natural progression of you loving someone, i.e., maybe it is your gift to them, i.e., maybe it is just what they expect of your grandparents to expect of you. Your ability to have a kid, your ability to have a kid is just naturally because you naturally love someone. As a result, couples just choose to have a kid because they think it is how they show their romance to another person, which is an entirely different matter. The second thing is, the vast majority of the time too, your attention is split between continuing the romance that made you so happy in the past and versus the attention that you're giving to the kid and the life. So more often than not, you have to make a trade-off. There are parents that prioritize their romance and neglect their kids. There are parents that just prioritize their kids and neglect that thing that made them happy the most or their partners. The last thing is having a kid is also a huge transition in transition from the life that you had to the life that you will have, considering that this is literally the center point of your life. Your life probably centered around your romantic partner. You probably tell them everything, you do everything with them, but the moment you have a kid, everything changes because you're more likely to have another person to take care of too. And if you don't do that, resentment builds up, and then you're far more likely in order to far more likely to neglect them and the like. So why then is this so much better on opposition side? The first main thing that our world changes is that the choice to have a kid is a lot more consensual than it is in status quo. So there's no other reason to have a kid or rather than just I want to have a kid and I want to raise them properly. On opposition side, maybe some people have that, but the vast majority of people on opposition side are swayed by narratives that they should have a kid because their religion tells them to. Swayed to have a kid specifically because these people think that they love one another. undeniably, these narratives prevail and exist in the status quo. It is what you see in the movies. It is what you are convinced is the purpose of your life for the vast majority and average person. But at the very least on our side, when the norm is you do not just do that with a romantic partner, the norm is you're more likely to just create a kid because you want to raise a kid. And that is so much better in the status quo. Number one, because it is the kid is actively wanted and their needs are actively prioritized relative to the status quo where people, or especially young parents, are still unsure of it and they don't know what to do. The second thing is you're far more likely to be prepared for this. You're far more likely to conceive this at a time where you're already stable, not necessarily when maybe you just want to have a kid because you're romantically attracted to this person. So the kid is just far more likely to have a better life considering that their decision to be having a kid is just far better. I think co-parenting when it's non-romantic is also good for a kid because you do not have the romance that could potentially make you stable. I think unstable. I think romance is a really hard thing to continue, especially since it naturally tapers off as you age and you age. It is a feeling that is volatile. Sometimes you feel it, sometimes you don't. There are lucky people that they constantly feel it, but the vast majority do not always have that fire and passion within their relationships. And that means is based on how this person feels could also be the ruin of their family. Maybe the dad cheats, maybe the mom cheats, and maybe the person feels neglected and are more likely to break up are more likely to break up the family and are just more likely to not care for the kid or are just likely to put kids in abusive or neglectful environments. The varies on our side, friendships are just far more stable and are just not built on emotionally volatile stuff. Friendships last longer for a reason, and I think it's because you do not emotionally depend on a person and your stability and everything else on your life on them. The very least on our side, maybe these people can still have romantic partners, but you keep that separate with their kid. Maybe they can still rant about their co-parent to their romantic partner. But on opposition side, you have nobody else to rant to because you wouldn't want to rant on someone you love or rant to someone that actively co-parents with you. I think for those reasons, it's very simple. When co-parents are just better off and when the kids are just better off in a better environment, I think it's just a better world. Thanks.
Recording stopped.
I would like to thank Prime Minister for that fine speech, and I would like to call upon Leader of Opposition to start a case for opening opposition. Hear, hear.
Yo, am I audible? Visible?
Yes, you are.
POIs through voice, raise it once, preferably from opening opposition. Full circle moment. Speech start in 3, 2, 1. So the first extension is simple. Why do friends opt into co-parenting on the comparative and therefore societal expectations on them scale up, which directly responds to opening opposition? Note that this was the missing link of OG since they kind of just assert that friends will come in out of nowhere without really explaining the dynamics of how society changes, which is crucial for their case because it lacks imagination, which is important for a THP motion. The first thing I'd like to ask is, why do people in relationships feel an incessant burden to care for kids they conceive? Because we as a society conditions ourselves to glorify the protection of kids even outside of whether or not they are born. And the thing is, this expectation and our idea of whether or not kids should be cared for exists outside of whether or not they were conceived by their conceived or being taken care of by the parents that conceived them or otherwise, indicating that there's a crucial lack in terms of whether or not this sort of expectation and this sort of burden is going to disappear under their side or just going to be shared across a multiple different set of people. I want to know the expectation of catering to that kid is placed on romantic partners by strong forces that they themselves concede to, like religion, like governments that mandate the partners have to do things like pay child support or ensure that their kid is getting all of these things in order for them to be able to, continue taking care of that kid. And in a different world, I'd argue that since the premium placed on children remains constant, it means that the societal structures that utilize this narrative as a means to gain things like legitimacy, because this was often something that every single person in the world organized recognized and something that every single person in the world agreed with, that means that they socially condition your friends and everybody in society to accept, to believe that this is their responsibility, no matter how small that responsibility might manifest, which answers the question ignored by OG of, why will your friend step up? Luigi's response to the POI I raised is a bit of a cheat because he says no, but the ways in which friendships and your expectations and the bounds by which they are developed are necessarily different from that of relationships. But this doesn't take into account the nuance of this house prefers motion, that the same narratives that tell us that it should be parents who are taking care of these kids could be similarly implanted in the minds of every single person to say that they have a say within every single child that gets abused, every single child that is born into the world, regardless, just for the fact that they're connected to them via friends. What that means is two things. The first is that the call-out mechanisms in ensuring that children are abused and ensuring that they aren't trapped in relationships that are necessarily bad, because I think the assumption in opening opposition was that oftentimes parents meet these burdens, oftentimes they don't, that means that the widened range in ways in which people interact with this is necessarily better, because it means that individuals see themselves as actively burdened with the safety of that child in the same way you would as a friend, insofar as the ways in which you interact with it are necessarily socially conditioned within your mind in order to believe that that's important. I'd also point out that children, this is the second thing, are very, very demanding in what they need to grow up well. And the crucial assertion OO makes is that romantic parents meet these demands. Many of them don't. Many kids grow up depressed or malnutritioned, either because their parents weren't there for them, their parents were divorced, their parents were separated. Many of their parents didn't have enough money in order to ensure that the food that this child has is actually sufficient for what they need. In a world wherein this burden is only placed on parents and therefore isn't being met, it's one that means it's harder for it to be met by kids. And this is where we also explain why the expectations for each individual person, however small it can be, at the very least can fill up these vast majority of the demands. Because sure, maybe you don't have money, but maybe your other friend has money and can pay for things like education. Maybe your other friend can pay for things like food, which only exists in a world where they feel a principled obligation to care for that by virtue of you being friends. But importantly, it's also the case that these things scale down. So it's things like emotional bandwidth, the willingness of them to be able to help you, which means that since the needs of each parent get smaller, it's necessarily easier for them to opt into the process of parenting in general. Importantly, this also explains why the dynamics between relationships also don't change as much, because insofar as small things, i.e. small incremental payments from everybody in order to pay for this kid's education exists, it's necessarily the case that the ways in which they interact with each other no longer become strained or tenuous. Not only does it mean that more people are able to ensure that kids are actually catered to by a larger set of people, but also it explains why the failures of parents are uniquely met in a world wherein this is scattered through the vast majority of the people. Before that, opening.
If you knife OG and say you have strong expectations on friends, you trade off any gov benefit because you symmetricize expectation. The difference is love is associated with commitment, narratives of true love, which is going to happen regardless alongside kid relationships.
So the reason why this doesn't work is because sure, you have some obligation on two people, but you don't explain why they can meet this obligation. You don't explain why parents can meet the obligations of their children. What's the comparative? Sending them to an adoption center that doesn't get better, which is the second extension. But I want to note why this is immediately debate winning. One, this wins over OG because of the prerequisite of their case. This was asserted coming from them. We actually explain it. Second, this responds to opening opposition, since we explain that the ways in which the expectations get managed rather become smaller and therefore distributed over a larger set of people through this friendship mechanism, and therefore becomes more able to do things like cater to the kid. The second thing that I want to talk about is, where does adoption centers, societal structures uniquely get better? And here I want to note that perhaps there exists some societal benefit in ensuring that you care about the child. But the thing is, the incentives and the premium placed on children remain the same. On either side, they are vulnerable, seen as the future of the state, and therefore there are lots of incentives in order to be able to protect them. That is to say that since this incentive exists on the side of the government, we simply ensure that the societal structures, i.e. people that fund things like adoption centers, laws, child rearing services, become far more potent and far better, insofar as the burden of taking care of a child isn't just relegated to that of women, insofar as they believe that there's a disproportionately large amount of pressure that is placed on women. But importantly, it's also that of your friends, whether they be women or men, which means that the incentive to care about child rearing services and fund it and vote for laws that ensure that it becomes easier or better now exists to a far greater extent when more people feel like they have a play within. When people, even if they don't believe that this is something that is necessarily important in the comparative are now emboldened to do things like donate and therefore improve the sorts of services that is the prerequisite. Maybe broken families exist on their side. It's only on our side in closing government where we explain that the political mass to improve things like adoption centers, laws, child rearing services, which decrease the tension within individual people get better. But the last thing that I want to talk about is why relationships get better. The flippant response we received to the POI is that, well, women and gender inequality is going to exist regardless. But the point is, child rearing and taking care of a child is uniquely the linchpin of what forces women home in the first place. And importantly, it's the tension. I want to note that it's not necessarily romantic partners, as what OG asserts, that makes bad parents. It's stressed parents. It's people who don't feel like they have to sacrifice everything in order to be able to take care of this child. In a world where we distribute it and therefore decrease the stress on individual people, it's when they're less likely to be stressed and therefore turn to things like abuse and bad parenting in the first place. For all of these reasons, closing government wins. Thanks.
I would like to thank member of government for that fine speech, and I would like to call upon member of opposition to start a case for closing opposition. Hear, hear.
Okay. For POIs, kindly POI me via the Zoom React raise hand function. I know which team you're from anyway, so just do the React where you raise hand like what Bea has been doing. Three, two, one. The most important tipping point and difference in this debate is to explain two things. A, why being in a romantic relationship allows you to balance both loving your partner and loving and rearing your child. This is the call out from both government teams that opening opposition don't answer will uniquely fulfill this burden. And second, why co-parenting with a best friend while having a romantic partner, if you choose to go that route, given the most vast amount of individuals will still want to find sexual fulfillment, will lead into inherent conflict with one another and is therefore unfeasible, also outweighing opening opposition's extension. Firstly, I will explain the capacity to be able to fulfill opening opposition's burden, which answer both opening government and closing government's burden push as to why support structures with your loving partner can also accrue while caring for your child at the same time. There are a couple of structural reasons. Firstly, because oftentimes when you fully trust your partner to the extent where you can be vulnerable, to the extent where you're willing to share deepest, darkest secrets about you, even being naked for them, for example, means that you also have less anxiety within the relationship on net. Because if you fully believe government's best case, or you can have multiple partners, for example, or even hop with different best friends and take different support structures for them, then you really don't have any real partner to fully trust or be vulnerable with. This is why the most certain benefit you bring to you from closing opposition is that you're less anxious, and that also translates to the child because it's a trickle-down effect. When your child is you're actively anxious about how you are in the house, how you're with a partner, that also affects the child's confidence, that also affects the child growing up in a negative way that we don't support. But second, and most importantly, oftentimes the child is the next level of your relationship because for a loving relationship, it is the manifestation of your love because it's how you choose, because having a child with your partner is literally saying that you're okay with taking the relationship to the next level because the child is a manifestation of you and your partner's love made into flesh. This is very, very important because this also means that you choose your loving partner well. So we don't get all the harms that side government talk about where they say that, you're unsure about the partner that you potentially choose. There are beatings, for example, or potential harassment. Because here, you would choose your partner very well if you understand in the norm under our side that this is the next level of your relationship and it keeps on going forward, and it's not just like a job that you take under government side. This is mutually exclusive because only when you see a child that's either A, being your living flesh, or B, someone that you consent to adopting, for example, under our side, in the worst case, with a person that you fully love, you get the benefit of capacity to do it better because of that dual-pronged obligation that exists under our side, which unlocks the romantic relationship being more fulfilling because the romantic relationship only becomes more fulfilling when you see this as the next evolution of your love to begin with. And here's where I want to highlight the extent of this. On government, it's unclear what the preferences that you will have with your partner because you didn't have a deeper development prior to having a child. What this means is that if the preferences with your partner, for example, how you live life, or where you want to send your kid to school, for example, or what religion they would grow up with, come into conflict because you don't resolve them prior, you have more constant fighting. That's bad because a child is harmed growing up under their side of the house. My other thing I'll talk about is to explain why then is romantic love necessary and overall good for raising a child? This outweighs the best case that we get from prop bench. The first is that you're just more willing to stay in the family if you feel that you have an active interest with your partner as well. And here's the frame, right? All things are correct. Child rearing is difficult and can be unmotivating. But oftentimes, the real tipping point and delta we bring from closing opposition is that it's the love for your partner that what keeps you going in that relationship because you have another reason to stay and labor for your child. What this means is that if you believe the best case from both gov teams, that yes, it is burdensome to like to care for a child, but you can always opt to other BFF, for example, or other best friends to care for their child as well. You have no real obligation for caring to one child. Or if you have other outlets toward your best friends, you're also less likely to care about the best friend to which you have a child with, co-parenting. This is important to our side, and this is the delta, because it is the dual obligation of loving and raising a child that makes the romantic relationship much more stable. This is the prerequisite to believing opening opposition's response that romance makes caring for the child better. Because we explain that there is a greater internal incentive to keep the relationship that translates to child rearing, that is a more proximate obligation and a more proximate incentive to you as an individual than the external incentive, which opening opposition explained, which is less influential because it's less proximate to you on weighing. This proves under our side why we are more stable in the relationship, why we help children be raised better under our side of the house, while also outweighing government bench. And the impact is this. Why is agreeing with a romantic relationship important? Because we proved you the inherent and exclusive benefits. Because if you opt, because on our side, what happens in the long run, therefore, is that we opt into better families because the preferences from the get-go with your romantic partner, with the child you want to raise, align, and this shapes already the rest of your life and how you want to live with them. This is why we're able to prove capacity. But more importantly, romantic relationships are a tipping point because being unsatisfied with your partner trickles down to how you influence a child, and more importantly, how the child necessarily perceives that relationship growing up, and therefore can necessarily be toxic or less influential towards the child. The second thing I wanted to talk about is that opening opposition proved that best friends split the attention. What we say is that people in the government world pursuing romantic relationships inherently comes into conflict with co-parenting with your best friend or someone else, which is a harm that opening opposition never explains. So opening opposition say that attention gets divided. What we would say is that if your partner cannot fully complement and fully fulfill you, for example, if you're unable to meet your sexual needs, then it also creates more doubts and creates more questions within the relationship. So for example, your kid asks you, why are you always going home late, Dad? Where are you going out at night? Why do you have a hickey on your neck? These are important, life-changing questions, which if you can't answer, your kid is just damning inside government under their side of the house. And this response to gov bench outweighs opening opposition because we prove that balancing both is much better under our side of the house, even if it's more tedious. Because being in a romantic relationship unlocks nuances and information about your partner you would have not found out without loving them. So yes, maybe you trade important secrets to your best friend, but you will never have a deeper level of that relationship to unlock further nuances, for example, about their deepest, darkest preferences, which are a tipping point, because this translates to how you influence your child in the long run under our side of the house. Lastly, to outweigh both government teams and everyone debate, there are two important things to take away. First, on our end, individuals will be more burdened than what closing government claim to care for their child. But more importantly, we prove capacity. All teams, regardless if from gov bench or opening opposition, just assume capacity exists. We uniquely provide the important mechanistic delta to suggest why capacity would uniquely exist under our side with the constraints of the motion under our side. But second, we also explain to you why the kind of burden for individuals in a romantic relationship, caring for children is a good thing because it's a dual-pronged obligation which necessarily keeps individuals to keep on trying, to keep on fighting the good fight for the future of the kid that's at stake.
I would like to thank member of opposition for that fine speech. Reminder for the room to be more active with POIs. And with that being said, I would like to call upon Government Whip to sum up the gov bench instead of this debate. Hear, hear.
Okay, hi. Am I audible and visible?
Yes to both.
Okay, perfect. Op is asking the wrong question. This debate is not about whether or not people stay, but rather whether those who stay end up being good parents and good influences on these children or not. And what we clearly point out from Sam is that it's not about whether or not these people stay and meet and therefore are able to meet their obligations by that extent, but rather that oftentimes the externalities that can influence a dual person household in which you only have two parents, or more importantly, in which the obligations are mounting, is one in which oftentimes relationships and therefore the ability to develop a child better therefore collapses. I want to first deal with CO and their two main extensions. Their main impact is to explain that you choose your loving partner. You choose your loving partner, which will be because that's the next step, which means that you'll probably choose a better person, etc., etc. I don't know what world CO lives in or how they therefore choose partners, but the vast majority of people don't decide who to date on whether or not they want to breed with this individual. In fact, I think there are more proximate considerations that come first. Oftentimes, you question of whether or not this person aligns with your values. Second, oftentimes, whether or not this person is actively abusive to you, but also just broadly, whether or not you get along with this person and they therefore make you happy. It is unclear to me why having this person be the one you will raise a child with will therefore make you choose someone better. But secondly, this also assumes that the vast majority of people want children, and that's the only motivation for them to be in good, meaningful relationships. So even if you believe their case, this does not apply to the vast majority of individuals who oftentimes live outside of those confines, but more importantly, don't necessarily want to have children. But secondly, I want to flip this. We would suggest this actually makes relationships on net far worse. Listen to their language. It's the natural next step. It's what's expected of you to make sure that this relationship matters. I think the vast majority of meaningful relationships can be meaningful outside of the context of having a child. And the problem with attaching it to, for example, having a child means that in the best case of people trying to fulfill their obligation, their metrics of success, therefore, is whether or not their child is a straight A student. It's whether or not their child, therefore, beats everyone in debate or is a world champion. And what all of this, therefore, suggests quite broadly is, in the world in which you believe CO, it's a world in which you believe that children are only trophies that show that love is good, and therefore you don't actually derive meaning from these children or care about their development. You only care about whether or not they're a good trophy to show that you're a good parent. But secondly, they would say that you unlock nuances of your partners that you would not have known otherwise. I think it is unclear why this is exclusive first and foremost, because as Sam points out, the stress unlocks the worst parts of you, which is that oftentimes it is on their world that you unlock things like people who become more abusive or more emotionally neglectful because they do not have time to care about their child, to care about their partner, and still work 12 hours a day. Or the fact that oftentimes they feel existentially afraid because a lot of the costs mount as they have more and more children. So if you believe the first extension of CO, this means you pressure people without the ability to take care of children, to have children, to legitimize their love, and therefore all the harm Sam explains actively gets worse. Clearly, that's why CO was said, let's deal with OO. I want to note that all their mechanisms on child development rely on friendships being as non-committal as it is in their world. As Sam points out, that actually isn't the Gov comparative, which by the way, OG never runs. Insofar as child rearing will always be a central societal value in either world because there's actual preferences for society to keep going. That's why we care about sustainable institutions, etc. But secondly, we would point out that the premium on biological relations, which OO relies on for expanded social support systems and obligation, only we would suggest does not exist insofar as this world develops quite differently. So the definitions of, for example, stepping stones of a relationship only exist on their world because they assign existential, self-propagating value to it, which we can therefore assign as well in our world to friendships, etc., that can be perceived to be the ways in which you can child rear, which obviously changes in our world, right? Where you develop differently. So OO status quo only has short-termist friendships because there's no instance in which responsibility is attached. So their case of child development has no impact in this debate because they debate on a false comparative of relationships on their world versus friendships on their world, as opposed to friendships that exist on Gov's world quite differently. But secondly, the child development they champion, at its best, only really benefit a very small, very privileged subset of children, those whose parents aren't stressed by externalities, those whose parents are the working middle class, because those are the only parents who can therefore take care of their children in the fullest extent. and privileged enough to do that, as what Sam illustrates. And what this therefore suggests is, number one, they are very small in impact insofar as the only strength and good obligation is the rich people who would probably have a good life anyway. But as Sam points out, the 1 hour in which you are too tired to listen to your child is that child's entire life, their entire instance of whether or not you are a good parent, which means that they will always feel unloved in opposition's world, insofar as it's incredibly difficult to uphold being a good parent in their world. It's quite simple. We would suggest that their child development does not actually exist on the larger sense of society, because as Sam points out, it is in our world where people outside of these biological confines are more willing to step in and care for you in comparison to yours, where no one is willing to do that in the times where inevitably the vast majority of biological parents fail. Before I go on, I'll take OO.
I explained why there's easier transition from partner to parents, why you're more rational, and why you stay in a relationship that CO repeats. If your obligation at CG is as strong as you say, it's not clear why it's not symmetrically stressful.
Well, the difference is you can have more people to do this. You can choose to do this as opposed to forcing it upon, for example, individuals who may not be ready. But again, the delta of change is that on our world where it's the norm for example, friends to co-parent, that is the world in which when other parents fail or leave, there are individuals around your life who are willing to step in outside of the confines of families who oftentimes can still fail you. I want to flip this pressure point therefore. Only actually proves that people will end up staying, not that they will do it well. So if you believe that the pressure is effective in making people stay, what this actually proves is why the worst externalities of having to be a better parent by always being there makes parents more resentful, makes them, for example, I think more importantly, unable to find meaning and fulfillment in their life insofar as they then have to become baby-making machines, which becomes far worse, by the way, for women. I think it's quite clear. We win on social welfare insofar as what O ignores is that it is an endemic reality that women are oftentimes left behind to care for this child and no one else is willing to step in. But finally, on relationships, who is to say that short-term relationships are inherently good? Or who is to say that, for example, relationships that do not have children are less meaningful? I think that's quite simply why it's far worse on their side, insofar as you have this reciprocal obligation for people to stay far longer, even if they are unhappy. Why do we beat OG? 1, we structurally prove there is a certain material. But 2, we explain the most important benefit, which is filling the gaps that most romantic couples fail in.